Welcome again to Authentic Manifestation. Today we are going to discuss Shaktopaya and the Upayas. Not in incredible detail, but enough to point you in the right direction so that you can learn more about the subject. Today when we hear or read about manifestation, often we think of the topic of imagination and visualization of some object or event. Of course, using all of the imaginary senses to fully engage the awareness, right? The topic of Shaktopaya is directly related to this, in that it is a sort of categorization used in the Kashmir Shaivite tradition to communicate any spiritual practice which uses the imagination and visualization faculties specifically. I'm going to repeat that. Any spiritual practice which uses the imagination and visualization faculties. There are three other paths or means in the Upaya system, one of which is effectively no means at all. That is to say that it may be then only by the grace of Shiva and the Guru. This is the path known as Anupaya, or the pathless path. Here one need do nothing. There is essentially nothing that can be done. The practitioner will be utterly overwhelmed by the Guru's power. On that note, it should be said that the highest spanda, or Shiva energy itself, as the operating power of the awareness, is not to be considered limited to the mechanism of one's subconscious mind, as is largely believed. It is far beyond that in terms of intelligence and capabilities. This is a very common misconception, which is directly addressed in Indian Tantra Shastra. The subconscious faculties themselves are not the actual power behind manifestation, according to ancient Indian sciences. In fact, the notion that the mind is the responsible factor or the power behind manifestation is not a new belief, and apparently the notion had become so widespread that at the time of writing, Samaraja felt the need to directly and strongly reject the concept in his commentary on the Spanda Karikas. Now we have to be clear here in terms of definitions, because on this channel we will be stepping foot in both worlds, both the Hindu and Buddhist Dharmic traditions, which use somewhat different terminology to describe similar phenomena. So to be clear, here we are sticking with the definition of mind used by the Kashmir Shaivites, and not the Buddhist notion of mind, which includes even the highest unified universal intelligence, categorized as the highest level of mind. So, again to clarify, here we are defining things from the Kashmir Shaivite perspective, that mind itself is defined by the mechanism of body-mind, and although it is of course one with all things, it is for purposes of understanding here differentiated from the universal field or spanda. Now, for what most understand as manifestation in terms of imagination and visualization, let's return to the subject of Shaktopaya. As mentioned, this is essentially the use of any mental techniques, many of which we will definitely cover on this channel. The broad use and essentially the very existence of this category of spiritual practice really goes to show just how integral the practice of imagination and visualization was to the ancient Indian cultures. Aside from this path, not to be confused with previously mentioned Anupaya, there is Anavopaya, which can be thought of as that which utilizes the means within the dimension of physical or immanent reality, such as hatha yoga, asanas or poses, or a homa fire ritual, astrology, Jyotisha, also tantric sciences which are considered to be along the path of Anavopaya. Lastly, the highest path is known as Shambhavopaya. This is a very simple to understand path in that the practitioner simply abides in the state of his essential true being. This true self, often referred to as the no-mind state, state of Shiva, Samadhi, Spanda, etc. In the path of Shambhavopaya, there are no visualizations, no mental exercises, and no rituals to be done. The seeker simply abides in the no-mind state, which, despite sounding trivial to the uninitiated, is said in the Vedas to be the very state of consciousness which is equal to Shiva. Hindu Shastra is quite clear that in this state of being, that which is willed to manifest will simply manifest. And not only that, it will manifest instantly. Essentially, in that state, the seeker is to be considered one with God Himself. This is the actual scientific means of attaining an instant manifestation. We will certainly cover more on this later and with references. So we can see, if we have even a basic understanding of the Upayas, that Shaktopaya is of course one of 4 paths, but it should not be simply considered to be just 1/4 of the equation. So let me explain what I mean by that. First, we have to consider that Anupaya is in some regards incomparable to the other 3. You cannot compare it to the other 3. There's simply nothing to be done by the recipient of the path. So that said, there's no intellectual knowledge to share or texts that can relate this upaya. So of course we can expect that the majority of people would find it easier to utilize the 2 paths of Anavopaya and Shaktopaya. This is an assumption we can safely make from Indian Shastra and the experience of the sages. That is to say that the highest path, Shambhavopaya, which is again abiding in the no-mind state of Bhairava, is not without its pitfalls for the so-called impure practitioner. Some texts go as far to deem the path altogether unsuitable, depending on your particular level of mental impurity. What does that mean? So, for example, the being with a tormented mind, one who hasn't completed with some traumatic memory, etc. Depending on their level of spiritual awakening, the path of Shambhavopaya may, in fact, not be right for them at that time. That said, don't let that deter you. You should practice this stopping of the mind. This is in fact the very definition of yoga from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. It is in fact, for all intensive purposes, your responsibility to do so. As my guru says, it is not difficult and it is not easy. Now, we're going to take this even a step further to really establish just how integral imagination and visualization were to ancient Hindustani Indian culture. From my own assessment, I would say that Shaktopaya has a root in both of the other 2 main upayas that can be practiced. And at times, Shaktopaya imagination could be considered as even a connection during certain key critical points of practice. It's almost impossible to escape finding a tantric practice which utilizes the mechanisms of Shaktopaya or directed imagination in some way. For example, on the so-called lower path, Upayas, where physical reality is utilized. Let's look at the ritual of prana pratishta, super powerful ritual used to install the breathing energy, prana, into a stone statue and literally bring it to life. So here, they're using physical vibrations, which are the mantras, but also intense visualizations to actualize the becoming of the body of the living murti, or statue. So then, if we look at the highest path of Shaktopaya, at times the means of getting into this path is actually a Shaktopaya directed imagination. Right offhand, I think of a specific tantric meditation where one thought is held. It can be any thought, an image. While holding the thought form is suddenly dropped. The instruction is to then simply abide in that empty space or the gap, which remains without engaging in any further thoughts. This practice would be considered Shaktopaya, which leads to Shambhavopaya. If the instructions are well followed, then the practitioner will achieve the state of Shiva. Anything he or she wills to be will instantly come into manifestation. These are just some of the basics, the understandings, which are almost always overlooked by most information out there, especially the information specifically geared toward the manifestation community. And we are going to cover a lot more of these topics right here on Authentic Manifestation.